instead of a viewer, I recently wrote me, using I and me generically and metaphorically, of course, and asked, since you absolutely, totally know what you're talking about and only talk about what you know, why do you keep using the may I suggest to use and may I hint to you instead of just saying exactly and directly what you're talking about? Which I might say is a very good question, if I do say so myself. But I thought I had mentioned that once before. Well, there's several ways of looking at it. One is it saves one from being dogmatic, which annoys some people. Some people love it. But when you present something dogmatically, especially something that's out of the mainstream, something a little unexpectedly, you're already inviting, well, anything you say. If you get and holler, boy, it's a pretty day. You should notice by now, people under any conditions, whether they be in a church, a synagogue, a nightclub, somebody's going to go, you call that a pretty day? So you're going to have resistance. But to do something a little out of the ordinary when people maybe are expecting something, perhaps out of the ordinary, and then you make it dogmatic, you could say that you're begging for even more resistance than might be necessary under even the most mundane of conditions. Put another way, it may be an absolute waste of time, but hey, I got lots of time. In other words, it gives you the chance to try and participate, was the other way I was going to say you could look at it. It's for someone, even if you know beforehand, even if I say, well, it's just a sort of a verbal game rather than me just constantly making dogmatic statements. You're saying, well, so-and-so, 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 which is one of the things I do with the news items. Just let them be a one-liner, just right in your face and just move on to the next one. But by saying things like, could I suggest, or is it possible, even though we know in advance that I'm just bullshitting. It's like it doesn't sound quite as bad, does it? It's like somebody saying, no offense, but you didn't ask my advice, but could I suggest you might feel better if you, quit staying stoned every day, or if you quit cutting your wrist, or if you lost a few pounds. Doesn't that sound better than walking up to somebody and saying, God, are you fat? Okay. Now I forgot why I wrote them in the first place. Well, I don't know, but it's always good to hear from me. I was going to mention some more about sort of just a casual talk about this sort of thing. Might give it one springboard on which to start, and that is the nervous systems, man's nervous systems, or the drive of man's nervous system for ever increasing complexity, which is, I guess I could shorten it, but that is a fairly succinct, direct, in-your-face, unconditional statement about what life is about, from one possible way of putting it. That you are a nervous system. And by that, you know by now, I mean a nervous system with a higher end, the neocortex, one that can think and talk. And the purpose of it, on this planet, the local purpose, is for it to become increasingly complex. Now, within that sort of framework, there is a fairly tempted to say, fairly simple, direct, and plain way of looking at this sort of activity, which is both simple, plain, and direct, and not so. And that would be to consider all aspects of anything resembling extraordinary, I know they used to call it spiritual / mental, evolutionary, individual effort. All of the ideas of God, all of the ideas of mystical experience itself, all attempts to communicate, or for people to believe that they're getting communications from unknown sources. All of the historical ideas of extraterrestrials, the UFO phenomenon. Every possible mystical experience that you could ever imagine could be looked at, not with extreme untowardness. don't write me, not with extreme untowardness, as being those areas of the nervous system not yet activated. All ideas of, I was going to try to give a litany, since I'm not an expert on all the New Age and occult phenomenon of astral projection, out-of-body experiences, of people believing that they have gone into a time warp, people believing that they are reliving a life from the past, people who believe that they are, this is not quite as common, but people who believe, in a sense, that they are in the future. Well, the simplest way, about the closest they come to it, is people believing that they can predict the future. People believing that somebody visited them, Notre Dame's great-great-great-great-grandson, the spirit thereof, and tells them, here's what the future is, or here's what's going to happen to you. Every strange thing, whether it sounds to you as being crackpot, or whether it sounds to you as being fairly reasonable, which could be a kind of crackpot litmus test, which I don't guess any of us would care to stop and go into, using us as the regal pejorative, leaving myself out. Don't write me about that either. All the way from would-be mystical experiences, of which you might personally find some favor with a particular one, such as meditating, chanting, praying. Something that you might consider, or it's something, in fact, you may have had some success with. All the way from that to the other extreme that you might consider completely beyond the pale. The kind of thing, as I warned before, that can make Hedrian want to bang his head on the wall. I'm not going to do it again. Everybody had that's 2 chances you had. All the way to the ones that would seem to be absolutely off the Richter scale of even pseudo-sanity. Of people talking to the dead, of people saying, yes, there's no doubt a flying saucer has landed, and I have spoken to one, and they were from another time zone, they were from another universe, and whatever. They are all, from one quite valid view, they are all phenomenon, or could be, like to hint, suggest, in spite of what I wrote to me, that it all is taking place inside of the nervous system, that it is not, it's irrelevant. It's immaterial, it's useless for a man to stand around and pick out anything, to believe or to ponder, to worry, to want to argue, especially with himself over, I don't care how many sane people say it, I don't believe that flying saucers or people from other realities land here and talk to people. All the way from that to somebody denouncing the Bible or the Hindu scriptures, literature, saying, I do not believe spirits have not come down. The actual creators of the universe, of reality, have not at times visited man. That is absolute insanity. And it is quite expected, it is quite reasonable for an ordinary sophisticated person today to feel that way, especially toward religious stories. And at best to take them as outdated mythologies. Allegories are completely out of hand. To say, well, it's just absolutely impossible, I don't care who said it. Now, I'm sorry that my mother and father believe the Old Testament, whatever they believe. God did not come down. There's no man somewhere in the sky, or angels. Angels did not come down and comfort somebody or help somebody in the battle or tell somebody the future. Are you sure? Bunky. Because the same people that would make that sort of denouncement, and I repeat, it is quite valid, it's quite expected, sophisticated, routine today for a man's nervous system to feel that way. But that seems where a man's nervous system would be looking into another area if he were fairly at the ordinary level, just sane and active, because his nervous system is still being driven by the need for increasing complexity. Increasing complexity always manifests itself as something outside the mainstream of what's going on, but it happens at such a gradual, understandable, such a non-startling, gradual actually covers it, but such a gradual pace that it does not startle people. It is noticeable. For instance, to use our day and time, circa 1994, people now of the adult in charge generation, educated, now, I just pick out one that comes to mind, they denounce the younger generation, not only on a statistical basis that their reading scores are going down, the SAT scores are going down. One thing, they will point out their addiction, their engagement, their constant engagement with electronic games, rather than pursuing textbooks, reading. And they can point out, and from their view, it is just a classic. It is a clear-cut example of how things are absolutely going to hell. That we got kids now, if you want to call it, I'm speaking now for them, they can say, well, if you want to call it any sort of talent at all, they can do whatever you do with those things. And they may have a certain amount of manual dexterity, which, a 30-year-old guy could say, you can get that other ways, kid, but we won't go into that either. Be sure and lock the bathroom door. But anyway, so you're getting a certain amount of manual dexterity, but their nervous system, I'm going to make it plain. What I'm saying is I'm countering what I just said about the growing complexity. That I'm taking an ordinary view that one generation, what I've been referring to as the older generation, as opposed to the younger, and it doesn't matter the age, but those who are now adults and have their own children, or at least old enough to, now they're saying that here's an example, that they would counter what I said and claim that the nervous system in this generation, at least the one behind us, is not striving, is not being driven toward increasing complexity. They're recruiting themselves. They're simplifying themselves. The cruting of America, the dumbing of America. Because here they are wasting their time, their reading scores are down, They're spending more time now playing dumb electronic games out at arcades or at home with a TV set, and they never read. They don't even know the titles of the classics. Forget having read them. You tell them Shakespeare, and they go, is that one of those new games? Is that the one where the knights are fighting? Every generation, which is every person, but every generation can only judge what was the increased complexity at his time. And it may have only mattered a few years, was all he had was like a small window from when the sexual energy, his hormones were peaking, and he sort of gave up the plans. He gave up thinking about the future. He only had a few years that he seemed to have increased his own complexity. With most people nowadays, it was the college years. And most of them, it dies before they're out of school. But anyway, somewhere in the late teens, early 20s. All they can do is judge what should be, or what they find to be, the increased complexity of the nervous system is whatever they found it to be. In other words, if the generation ahead of you, whoever that was, if they found that the increased complexity of the nervous system was brought about through education, primarily reading of books and listening to lectures, then they have no choice, but that's all they see as the way to increase complexity of the nervous system. You understand? Now, I'm not defending, it doesn't need it, but what I'm saying is I am not defending the playing of arcade games as opposed to anything else. But a generation who did not use that as the way that they apparently made their nervous system more complex, challenged the nervous system, if that was not their way, whatever their way was the way, and anything that's not that way is regression. It just doesn't make sense, but it mainly is regression. That's the only thing they can call it is, wait a minute. When I was growing up and I was expanding my consciousness, my intellect, when I was expanding my worldview, I was reading history. I was in school, I was taking history, and I was taking the social sciences. I didn't major, but I was taking physics. I even got into 2 years of chemistry. I was, of course, always interested in the fine arts. I was expanding my view of what civilization is about. That is not the same as some kids standing there all day looking at a TV set and the mad Mario brothers are chasing each other. That they're not only are they not increasing the complexity of their nervous system, they're decreasing it. Makes sense? But every generation, that was sort of a side trip. Well, it wasn't completely a side trip, but it was in case any of you have ordinary people inside of you, and I don't speak up for them tonight, is you can always turn around. By the way, it just proves that you're getting to be an old shit, an old fart. I'm sorry, an old fart. I didn't mean to be that. That if you cannot see that from some view everybody is continuing and they don't have anything to do with it. We're talking about now at just ordinary mechanical level that every generation, man collectively, his nervous system is continually pushed to be more complex. It's not in question. I'll go ahead and make at least one dogmatic statement. Couldn't resist. That it never stops and you have nothing to do with it. And it doesn't matter whether you understand it or not. The nervous system continues to, every generation, increase in complexity. It's just that the reason I brought up that example is that if you need any affirmation that you are about washed up and over the hill and dead on your feet, is if you can look around and go, well, now I know I tried, even when I didn't know what I was doing. I tried to increase the complexity of my nervous system. I even read now. I read things. Sometimes I'll pick up a magazine in which I have no interest, just to try and increase my view. And look at these little snits nowadays. All they do is glue to a damn video game, skateboards, who knows what. There's your proof. It is continuing to increase in complexity. Back to what I was going to talk about in a little more specifically. Outside just the normal evolution, the normal mechanical complexing of the human nervous system, there remains that area, those areas that appear to be at one time religious, spiritual, metaphysical, transcendental, occult, spooky, outside the mainstream. But rather than being fitted with all those names, even though they range from being fairly acceptable, such as religious, to being somewhat derisive, like spooky and nutty and occult and new age, you can quite easily, directly and plainly see them as an individual man's, we'll speak of individually now, of a man's nervous system itself. It's already being driven to become ever increasingly complex. And with some people, it's driven that they hear voices. Now I'm talking about back from the mainstream view, that these individuals, they hear voices, they see things, they see delusions, they have experiences that are imaginary. They, in an impossible way, claim to have fooled around with time and space. That about covers it. Talking to the dead, seeing the dead, seeing signs in the sky, hearing voices whisper to you, seeing creatures from another world. I mean, that about covers it, wouldn't you say? That's about as nutty and fruitcakey as you can get from the mainstream view. Oh, come on, folks. That doesn't happen. The tricky part is, I'm not talking from the mainstream view of psychotics, which is another story altogether, and it's not even that, you can't even shave it that close. But I'm talking about people who otherwise seem to be sane, and they pop up, and it comes out that they say that they have been visited by somebody from another world, or that God or something not human, talked to them, or that they fell into some sort of trance, got into some sort of state, and that they could see, feel, experience things that they had no idea, they had no preparation, they cannot truly explain it to satisfy themselves, and it was not only as real as ordinary life, but more so. That they had that kind of spooky, fruity, fruitcake, nutty kind of experience, but otherwise they appear to be rational. From the mainstream view. That's why I'm trying to distinguish them from your run-of-the-mill psychotics, which are just sort of people who do it for a living. But those who simply, well, all the religious literature, all the mystical literature, some of the philosophy you read in a certain way, they are filled with such figures. And of course, fairy tales and myths, but at any rate, even in what's taken to be history, there are people who otherwise seem to be fairly sane. But they, either periodically or one big time, they seem to fall into some kind of hole of unreality. And they come back and they say things about talking to spirits or seeing things. And But otherwise they seem sane. They seem rational to ordinary people. Since we have the larger background of full-time nuts, the psychotics, from the ordinary view. Remember, it's not us making the judgment. It's just those that are outside the mainstream of collective reality. Since you have those, then collective reality, with what few people that I'm describing that do seem otherwise sane and then go insane, it's easy enough to dismiss them. You don't really have to think about them, they're so few, but if you did have to think about them, you simply have the background over here. It's like, here you are, you're a sane, middle-of-the-road person, middle-class person, and you're part of the main herd. You're surrounded by the main herd, bankers, cow insurance agents, cow attorneys, cow judges, cow priests and rabbis. And over here are a few strays. They're over there like in pens by themselves. They're full-time psychotics. They're lame cows. Cows that try to fly. Cows that try to make noises like worms or hawks. You know, everybody knows, well, these are not right. Then if a cow here in the midst that otherwise seems sanely bovinian, don't write me, bovinely sane, and suddenly pops up and has some kind of Milky Way experience, if you have to face up to it, to think about it, the point is you've got the background, you've got the ready-made classification that everyone knows they're full-time nut cows. And so the cow that you thought was fairly sane pops up and suddenly recounts one of these nutty out-of-pen experiences. If you have to think about it, all you got to do is go, oh, well, he's mistakenly was over here for a while, but we know where he belongs. Try again back to the specific, or the more specific. You can look. Now remember, we're not talking about those, all the well-known ones, just to give you something to go by so that you don't think that I'm trying to skirt the issue, but all the famous ones, to the ordinary, the Moses and Abrahams, Confucius, Buddhas, Jesus, Zarathustra, all the Hindu gods, everybody that you ever heard of, and then all those you haven't, but the minor. Anyway, covering all of that, if you took them as being otherwise sane, middle-class people, even now would take the kind of examples I use as being beyond sane. They would say that it was not necessary for me to stop and make a special category or give an exemption for Jesus and Moses, that, they obviously weren't insane. That's not in question. They were just, parts of God or touched by God. Still in all, assuming that you're not tied to it in an automatic way, then you could look at, from just the general history, that the people otherwise seem sane, seem to be able to motivate and live a routine life if they had to, and yet suddenly or unexpectedly said, by the way, God's been talking to me. Or by the way, I can turn around and I not only see you people, but like I see your twins out there. Or every time I look at you, I see two of you. And when I look out at what runs the universe, the rest of you are saying, it's either uphill or downhill or up or down. I see that there's a third direction. No, I can't tell you what it is because I don't even have a name for it. But it's there, and it explains why you think that things either go up here or not. And the crowd goes, well, Abraham always seemed all right until, just every now and then he seems to have these kind of, fits. But other than that, he seems all right. And the truth is, as I point out, historically, they seem more than all right. And so after the fact, they're normally given supernatural powers. That, he was not insane, but since that is not sane, since that's not part of our collective sane reality, what he said that he experienced, what he saw, what he felt, then, and he's not nuts, so UFOs, God, the inexplicable. You can see absolutely all of that as being one man's nervous system, and it has become activated in an area that is more complex than the collective area of his time and place. you could see all voices of God under whatever guise. You could see all ideas of ancestor worship or spiritualism, that is, talking to the dead, talking to the departed. You could see all the ideas of extraterrestrials, the full UFO phenomena throughout history, of people who say, I am sane, I can't believe what happened to me, and especially, I am going to throw in, especially in the time in which most of us have lived collectively, speaking just chronologically in sequence, the drug phenomenon. Because if you have any trouble getting your fingers on the ledge of what I've talked about thus far, enough of you, if not all of you, had enough drug experience, well, even a minor, from all the way from pot, the drugs, getting a little off, but surely all of you know this, that fool around with drugs, they seem to have different effects, which everyone knows that, but I was going to say they have different effects on different areas of igniting the nervous system in a more complex way. That's why some people like booze, which is about as crude as you can get, and some other people say, oh no, pot. People, pot, that's child's play, give me a little, little Coke. And other people say, no, it's got to be the psychedelics, it's got to be the mushrooms, LSD. But at any rate, to take it beyond just the idea or the realm of religion and philosophy and occult speculation, how many people, asking rhetorically again, how many people have not had some sort of near mystical experience off drugs? That is, as simple as pot, as simple as turning around, the effect always diminishes, but at least the first time or two, that under the right conditions, that even with pot, which is not much better than booze, but even with booze, except booze makes most people sick. Get back to the subject. So it's hard the first time to have any sort of mystical experience when you're throwing up. Which is not like the mushrooms. You don't throw up and then get all right and then have the experience. With booze, the first time you simply throw up and there is no after. It's not like, this is a mystical experience. What the closest thing to enlightenment is you throw up and you think, God, I'll never do that again. I guess that's about as close as booze, as alcohol ever gives you to an awakening. It's the first time you do it and you think, well, now I see why my uncle wouldn't drink. Damn, I'll never do that again. But of course, most people have the will to press on and try it again. One other little thing, maybe I never mentioned, but it's something you can get a little something from. I'm mentioning booze and pot and coke and hallucinogenic areas. Anything that man does, just for a second, the physical intake, not the impression from entertainment and higher neural hobbies, but just of actual literal material ingestion. Anything that is not a direct contributor to the nourishment of the hormonal physical system is some form of drug. I mean, it shouldn't come as a shock, but if you think about it for a second, caffeine, nicotine, very low level, and you're kind of wasting you can get a buzz, as some of you know, if you don't drink coffee. Or those of you who don't drink coffee for a week or so and then go back to drinking it. And I can't promise it's a mystical experience, but it will excite the nervous system in an unnatural, in a non-normal way, which is why people do it, plain and simple. The only reason people put nicotine in the body. For people to say, my God, why was somebody, I can't understand that. Well, I just show how much they understand. They can't understand anything. Everything that man does along those lines is not a direct input to physical nourishment, and it's some sort of material intake. Chocolate. They've already found out chocolate's got a little, at any rate. And then, of course, you do it to yourself through the ones I left out, the kind of intellectual hobbies that affect what they're calling the neurotransmitters, the lightning and the goo into your own brain. But back to the main path again. All of the drugs, all of the dreams of occult experience do one thing. And I'll quit hinting and suggesting, they simply do one thing. It's no secret. It's not that hard to understand. You can't even deny it. I could get ordinary non-weird people, hard-nosed scientists. They'd have to say, yeah. All of that, the drugs, let's stick with the drugs for a minute because they could measure that. They could put somebody in a laboratory and scientists could say, all right, never mind his interpretations, the condition this guy's in. He just took the buttons. So we see, he's zonked out. So never mind the kind of dreams he comes back and tells me that he's talking to some ancient god from Norway or Mexico. Never mind that. We can hook him up and we can measure his brain chemistry. We can measure the electrical activity of the brain. We can tell that he is in, I don't know what it means, but we can tell that he is not in a natural neural condition. They say, well, sure, you can do that. We do not know what to make of it. That doesn't mean I buy his interpretation that he's in there babbling. Now we can listen in the other room. You can look at his eye. Well, anyway, a superficial examination of the man would tell you beforehand that he's in some sort of unnatural condition. Epilepsy, Gruber syndrome, drugs, something. I wish the Gruber Syndrome Society would quit writing me too. But they could say beyond that, we are now measuring scientifically. We can measure that there is something in the man's brain activity that is absolutely non-normal, non-standard. There's no doubt about that. I am not interested. He's in there talking now. We have no interest. We don't know what to do with it. It's outside our field. He's in there talking about now that he is seeing some sort of golden spider webs linking him to the cosmos. The man's babbling. I've heard drunks say things like, hey, I talked to my dead mother. So we don't know what to make of that. But there's no doubt. His brain activity is outside the norm right now. So there's no doubt about that. I am now telling you what it is. It's just not that hard. They just got no business seeing it. They've got no need to see it in this manner. It is the same thing that men do when it works with the mystical traditions and practices of fasting, chanting, dancing, just sitting. It always comes out, or is always the way it's been passed around after, you can say, the original ones discovered how to do it, which is the ones who can do it, you have to discover how. But anyway, after that, then they had to pass along the sequence, the lineage, the continuum of the great mystical tradition. That you come up with doing something, and the doing something always has to be out of the mainstream, because if it's what everybody else was doing, everybody could do it. So you come up with some attempt, you come up with some practice. You don't come up with it. If it's a practice, you got it somewhere. Because if you could do it, you don't have a practice. Of course, you got one, but nobody knows what it is. So if you got a practice, you didn't come up with it to stick with truth and advertising. But whatever it is you're trying to do, all the way from, as far removed as they may seem to be, all the way from trying to sit immobile and not move for 12 hours a day, to getting up and dancing 12 hours a day, spinning in a circle, chanting one word over and over and over, of doing something dangerous, taking up mountain climbing, jumping off of high cliffs when you don't know what you're doing, always being on the verge of killing yourself, some dangerous experience, all the way from that to apparently the opposite of that, of sense deprivation, locking yourself up in a black room, airtight, and just sit there. Well, they were doing those sleep tanks and those isolation tanks. They've been doing such as that, and they might seem to be far removed, but they're all after the same thing. All the way from that to the simple, direct way, take some drugs. Praying, if you get over the idea, if you loosen yourself from your collective cultural bondage to your father's religion or the religion around you, praying is the same thing. Same thing as whirling and chanting. You could be chanting, moolah, 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 or ooga, ooga, ooga. It doesn't matter. You could be doing it. You're trying to do something, and what you're trying to do is excite, to activate your own brain area in places where it is now inactive, which makes you more complex. let me jump ahead and assume that everyone can see that. That's not that hard to see. Not that hard to think about. It's not that hard to think about enough to go, yeah, okay. If you get that good, though, it can become even better, because that's really dealing with spatial matters. It can get into temporal matters, which, of course, if you get conscious at all, there is no difference anyway. But all the ideas that I've just covered that are spatial, of God, flying saucers actually visiting you, or spirits actually visiting you, or disembodied spirits, voices coming to you in the night and talking to you, or voices while you're meditating, or voices while you're in a deprivation room or tank. All of that seems to be spatial. It happens in what seems to be real time. That you say, yeah, it happened. I looked at the back door and there was a figure. I've never seen anything like it. I can't describe it. And he told me things I'd never heard. Or I heard voices and I don't know where they came from. All that would appear to be, if it happened, just the way people describe it, appears to be absolutely spatial in nature. That is real time, that you say, so it happened to you last night. Yes, last night. It's happened to me 3 nights in a row. Whatever it is, you understand, it's spatial. It is in real time. And yet, if you can see it, all of these so-called transcendental experiences, reports, history, we'll slip up on it real quick, have a temporal element. Enough slipping up. Enough slipping up. That was slipping up. I'll give you a second. Have a temporal element. They have a certain amount of time shifting to them. How about that? No. Enough hints? If you get good, you can move it completely beyond what seems to be the limitations of spatial aspects and say this. Just using the ordinary terminology again. A man says, God spoke to me. Shiva, Vishnu, Buddha, somebody from another planet. Do you know what they're also saying? They have no choice. What they're saying is, the future spoke to me. Which, if you're real good, is what I mentioned 30 minutes ago, that even those who say the dead people are talking to me, that would appear to be the opposite, right? People who are dead. That is, the past is talking to me. Mm-mm. That was a little hobby for those of you who want something on your own. Work on that one. It's the same thing. But back to the ones that perhaps I can make a little easier to chew on. A man's nervous system, I'll just use God again, or UFO, take anything you want. Disembodied voice, unidentified voice, talks to a man who's otherwise sane, perhaps even a man who is struggling for some sort of transcendental experience in his own nervous system. When he says, something extraordinary happened to me, what is he saying? Whether it's a voice, whether it's a picture of somebody, whether he believes a flying saucer actually landed, what's he saying? He's saying, I saw the future. Put another way, the future saw me. Put another way, I was suddenly in the future. Put another way, the future was in me. No matter what you call it, anybody who says that they saw God or God sent them a message, I'll tell you what sent them a message. Was a part of their, again, assuming we're not talking about the run-of-the-mill crackpot cow over here that's outside the main stockyards. A man otherwise sane who says that God talked to me. What he is saying is my nervous system became activated, because I always draw my little thing. I have to draw it spatially, but above the level of consciousness, spatially, above that level, this is what appears to be real time now. Up there is the part that I'm talking about that is not activated in everybody. It's not the same in everybody, but the part of your brain that is not activated, that is the future. That is what the brain, that is what the nervous system is expanding for, to become more complex. But that in itself tells you to become more complex. All right, when? Well, in the future, obviously. I mean, if the future means, well, next week. I'm working as hard as I can, or if it means next year. You understand, there's the temporal element that goes unsaid, unanalyzed in all of man's statements. Well, anything that's even verging on being positive and growth related, it's always about the future. Because if you're saying, well, I'm going to improve myself, nobody says when. I don't mean if they mean next Thursday. If you say, if there's only 3 times, like now, the past, and the future, and you say, I'm going to better myself, nobody says when. That's stupid. You're not going, and you say, well, in the past, which of course is an easy way out, but it goes unsaid. It is part of the definition, although linguistically and in a certain kind of curious neural sense outside of simple rhetorical considerations, every time you speak about space, you're talking about time. In the sense I'm saying now, that if you say, well, I'm going to do better, I'm trying to do better, I want to understand more, you don't even say, well, wait a minute, when? Do I mean now or in the past or, I don't know, in the future? Not only is it ridiculous, that if you could do it in a certain way, it brings up very, shall I say, yes, disturbing additional questions. Like, wait a minute, if I can do better in the future, how come I can't do better now? Or wait a minute, if I am not determined to do better, and it seems to be, it has to be in the future, and I'm determined to do it, and I think I know what I should do, why the hell didn't I do it before now? The ordinary cows, people, it serves them best not to even get involved with such matters. So when you talk about the nervous system always being driven, whether you individually are or not, that the collective nervous system of man is being continually driven by the need, by just the drive, not the need. Let me straighten out my own syntax. It is being, the nervous system is driven to become increasingly complex. This always is a matter of tomorrow. If it weren't, it'd be now. And if it was now, then you have to be more complex tomorrow. You can't ever stop. Humanity doesn't stop. But whenever people talk about, back to where we were, whenever people talk about, I had some sort of mystical experience as something actually transcending all known experience or knowledge I ever had before. Something happened to me, and I'm telling you, as insane as it sounds, I am telling you it was just as real as everyday sanity. And yet something spoke to me, something just from another world, somewhere else, which absolutely fits the kind of, at least semi-non-mainstream paradigms spatially. God spoke to me. A flying saucer. But see, all that spatially, that something happened to me outside the normal experience, spatial experience. If you can expand your view of that, it's past space. And there's something useful to this. It's not some philosophical game I was trying to play. It's the future. That all ideas of gods, UFOs, all mystical experience is a shift in time. It is a transfer of time from the person's consciousness from wherever they are. It doesn't matter wherever they are, but wherever they were, their brain became ignited in a place that's not normally, and we can say it's physical. I can use my chart, or we could say that we could actually have somebody there measuring, a scientist with no interest in this kind of stuff, measuring. So you're right, I don't know what to make of it, but his brain is literally operating in places that we don't know what the hell. I mean, there's no need for that. Of course, then they could also prove if the guy was talking, normally life protects itself, and he was talking, it probably would be, to the scientist, Babel. Like, well, his brain is, we can measure, his brain is operating in places that there's, look at all the literature. We got all the equipment now, people's brain, this area is just unknown. We don't know what the hell it does. And you're right, his is operating. If that proves anything, we can measure it. But also look at this. Listen to what he's talking about. He's talking about flying saucers. So that proves right there. It's unnecessary. Mm-hmm. That kind of displacement The ordinary mind can only do it physically, spatially. Thus you have the ideas of God. Thus you have the ideas of something extraordinary happening where? Outside of me. It's flying saucers. It's past dead teachers. It's past ancestors who now are depository of all known wisdom. It's always something displaced spatially from the person. The usefulness of this, I was going to suggest, is that there's nothing to wrestle with. There's nothing to ponder. There's no intellectual arm wrestling going on about, well, wait a minute, do people actually talk to God? Do people actually see flying saucers that are otherwise sane? Or do people actually hear voices tell them things that sound extraordinary, but that's nuts? If you get over it being spatial and it becomes a temporal thing, that it's not them being spatially displaced from the ordinary mainstream of sanity. Their brain literally has been displaced temporally. That even though we could physically say, my scientists were hooked up to a guy and they say, yeah, his brain's operating, then I could draw up here and go, all right, up here is where it's not operating, allegorically. But physically, I could say, and up here, all mystical experience, people talking to God, is this part of the brain gets going and they don't know what to make of it. I mean, it's so foreign. We could say that spatially, but then you end up in an argument. You can't, even with yourself, because spatially, then you always say it's got to be outside of me. Hence God, hence UFOs, hence talking to the dead, hence anything external. But if you get over it, even there being some sort of quantum embankment, there's any sort of division between time and space, instead of you displacing it out there or worrying about other people in the past saying, wait a minute, I can't believe that kind of stuff because this guy said God told him. And I know it. I can't deal with that. I know that is irrelevant. I'm speaking for somebody. If you get over that, well, that's a waste of time. If you get over that, you understand that ordinary people, when their brain becomes activated in an area in which it is not normally so, they have to feel that they have been displaced spatially. In drugs, people say, think of all the terms. I tripped out. I was on a trip. I went somewhere. And they will say it. And they may, under cross-examination or under friendly discussion, they may go, well, yeah, I can't say that I don't know physically. When I was on that biggest trip, when I was out in San Diego back in '67, I was out for like 3 days, and I literally thought, well, I believed. I experienced that I was in the Andromeda strain, the galaxy, and that I was on a planet, he gives you some name, and the creatures told me stuff, and they turned it over, and I could suddenly look, like with the largest telescopic eyes, I could look back at planet Earth, and I knew I was like billions of miles, light years away, and then I could look back at the planet and see you, I could see my mother, I could see, and you think, well, it's got to be allegorical. And the person might even say, yeah, now that I'm off the trip, I'll admit, it sounds like it had to be allegorical. And yet when I was experiencing it, when I was on the trip, when I was tripping, the terms themselves, that I was displaced physically, spatially, that is. That at the time I really felt, that was reality to me, that I was actually on another planet. I was actually in the presence of alien beings. It is a feeling of spatial displacement, which you can argue over. And the sane part of you will say, well, there is no real argument. The guy was on a bad trip. The guy's nuts. The guy's psychotic. Or there's the kind of useless effect that drugs can have on a person. If you get past that and look at it as being a childish attempt to explain what is in essence a temporal displacement, then it's all limited to a more convenient and, may I say, useful area. And where might that be? Your own damn head. You don't have to worry about the Andromeda strain, or you don't have to worry about, I will sail off with Captain Kirk and go where no man's ever gone. You don't have to worry about that. The place no man's ever gone is right here, except this, remember, if you get over it being a spatial displacement, that, wait a minute, I don't get too weird and have God talk to me. As a matter of fact, that's not too weird. That's not weird enough from one view. Because you got to get past it either being too weird or not weird enough and realize it is not a spatial displacement that's happened to me. The real transcendental experience is not a spatial phenomenon. Even though we can say that I've been trying to describe it for a long time and still can, that yes, your brain itself, the areas of the brain, yeah, I know, we've all been through that you can measure, yeah. And so spatially, a mystical experience, let's count all the hint and the rest of it. Let's say we had a Buddha, just for instance, and we had him here and we hooked up electrodes to him when he was in one of the blown away stages. He's there. And we could measure his brain, and you could actually measure, trust me, if they had the right equipment or I had the time to show them how to do it. And they could physically say, all right, his brain right now is operating in an area, and we've got no other records. We got records of me, all of the people where I went to school, the whole medical faculty at Harvard. Nobody's brain actually operates in that one spot. So we can say, all right, then there it is. It is spatial. Yeah, it is. But if you never get any further than that, which is what happens with those that have a one-shot mystical trip, the impossibility of ever putting into words, there are several ways to explain that difficulty, which I've already given you several, but here's another one, is you're taking that which was a temporal phenomenon and you're having to now put it back in spatial terms. And so you spatially displace it. You go, well, Jesus, I flew to another planet. Now don't jump. Now I know it may sound weird. Now I know it sounds weird to me now that I'm off the trip. But God spoke to me. I don't know it was God. He didn't say it was God. But I'm going to tell you, somebody spoke to me and told me stuff that I had always wanted to know. And I'm going to tell you what, it was not a human voice. It was not a human voice. I don't know if it was God. I shouldn't have said that. It was, hey, I'm going to tell you what, mystical experience doesn't cover it. All right, so they say that, and what have they done? The experience was a spatial displacement. From that comes, back to where we started the evening, I always like to wrap it up nicely. All ideas, all notions of gods, mystical experiences of every possible stripe. Again, discounting what the ordinary would call psychotic or psychosis of some nature. Just ordinary people who apparently have extraordinary experience that cannot be explained and that they then come back to normalcy. Those kinds of things, which is God. Not just the mechanical rote of going to church or temple, but those that one time said, hey, I had a personal experience, a religious experience. That to people who believe that they've been contacted by extraterrestrials, those who believe that voices, disembodied voices, have spoken to them. All of that is a physical displacement, an attempt to explain it after the fact, but it's always on the basis of an external source. It was an externally tied phenomenon. Not that everything you do is tied to the external world, you could say. But what after the experience, if you don't understand it, if you don't know what we're talking about, then all you can do is say, the only reason I had this experience, now I guess I earned it a little bit because I have been fasting for 5 years. I have been lighting, I've been undergoing some religious or spiritual tradition, some discipline. I've been meditating, I've been fasting every Thursday, I've been lighting candles, I've been praying. So I was working up to it. But when it happened, I can't tell you why. Or even on drugs, somebody said, well, hey, I've taken LSD, I guess, 50 times in my life. And it's been fun, I guess, more fun than drinking. But never until last week did it happen. Did I have, whatever it is, you understand, they can say, well, I've been working on it. I was trying to earn it. But when it happens, and you don't understand it, all you can do is look at it as a physical displacement. That is, that the only reason this happened, even though I was working for it, been praying for it, always wanted it, it happened and it was beyond my control. That is, it was beyond me. That God, call it whatever you want to, the power of the universe, I don't know what it was, but it happened. And if I could just get back there, is the way they like to put it, which is the same thing, tied the same thing as tripping, that it is a spatial movement. That if I could get back there, if I could get back to where that voice spoke to me, if I could get back to that one spot when all the planets, under the astrological forces, when they were just right, and the voice came to me and told me things, if I could get everything back like that, then maybe it happened again. It is not spatial. It is spatial in the sense that 2 and 2 is 4, and that's arithmetic. But where are you going to get in life to carry the parallel to try and get a better job? And they say, well, we need somebody who is well versed. What you will be doing as the assistant head of the mathematics department. Oh, yes. Yes, I know all about algebra. Or I know all about arithmetic. You got to do better than that. It's not that arithmetic is no longer true now that you're an expert in algebra, but it's been swallowed up. Something swallowed not only Jonah, something swallowed the whale that swallowed Jonah. If you look at it as, if you're stuck with it being a spatial displacement, that something happened to you rather than something happened in you, and that's the beginning and the end of it. That's all you need to know. Did I talk to God? Okay, I did. But he was in my brain. Oh, wait a minute, I talked to people from another planet. Okay, fine. But that other planet was in your brain. Yes, but I talked to dead people from the past. Fine, but they were in the future in your brain. I said it was plain and simple and direct, but I guess it could give some people a headache, get some confused, and make others leave the room. Have we got 25 seconds to kill? What in the hell can you talk about? Well, that was all my prepared statement, and I feel a bit chagrined that I didn't have it timed better to where it... So I trust you'll accept my sincere apologies, and if not, if we got enough time, I'll drop my pants and moon you. No, that's right. We promised that now that we're in the 90s, the show is going to be, I forgot to tell you, we're going to be more of a 90s kind of show and be a sensitive show.